All right, well, let's begin. It's good to see each of you tonight. It's been a while since we've had one of our classes. The last two or three, I can't even remember anymore, have been canceled. So I'm thankful we could have a class tonight. And just before we start, as you can see, if you all want to go, you can look in the window down here. Not the next window. The next window is ours, but the one after that, the second one after that, the big window, and in the door, you can see the room that we will end up with, and just kind of get the layout. And so the closing is on Wednesday, and as I said, just keep praying about that as we go into the weekend and into this coming week, that everything works out. I got all the closing documents from the lawyer today, and so I'm going to look at all that stuff, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just closing stuff and money instructions. That's the big thing for right? So anyway, so let's go ahead and pray. Our Father, we come before you with thanksgiving, and we certainly are grateful that we can be here tonight. We praise you for your goodness and mercy. We think of our rich Baptist heritage, and I pray that as we live here in this time, that we do honor to those that have gone before us and struggled for freedom and the ability to worship as they saw fit according to their conscience. Pray that you would help us to understand, give us clarity of speech and thought. In Jesus' name, amen. So our theme, as you recall, is Psalm 11:3, and it's, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And I looked at the beginning of the year. As I recall, we looked at the Great Awakening, because the Great Awakening is very integral to understanding the history of the United States. Now, secular history, it's more of a footnote, right? It was just this little thing that happened, and it was a religious uprising where people got enthusiastic about religion one last time, and then, but they really don't speak of the impact that it had on our nation and on the revolution. It had a major impact on our history. And even tonight, I'm not going to look at the actual revolution. I wanted to just lay the foundation, talk a little bit about the Battle of Alamance and the War of the Regulation. That also is a footnote. How many of you, other than me mentioning it, knew about the War of the Regulation in North Carolina prior to the Revolutionary War? Anyone here? Huh? Right. So and the Battle of Alamance took place in 1771, and we'll look at it here in a little bit. So, as I said, the Great Awakening not only resulted in a widespread turning to the Lord in the colonies, but it also sowed the seed of liberty in the very fertile minds of those folks that it took root in, right? And they were really freedom lovers. They became freedom lovers, and Baptists have historically been freedom lovers. That's where I was getting to on Sunday, or Wednesday, I guess, when I mentioned the twin pillars of the Declaration of Independence. I've been reading Robert Bork, right? The book he wrote, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, and he was a candidate. He was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he was borked, as they say. That's where they use now. He was put down, right? And he would have been a very good conservative member of the Supreme Court. But he talks about the problems with, for example, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because, and he was very much in favor of both of them. But he talks about how, the push for freedom and the push for equality, which are the twin pillars, always came with a caveat. There was an assumption of law. There was an assumption of morality. There was an assumption of authority, and there was an assumption of restriction. And so in the Declaration of Independence, you don't see any restriction at all. It's very general, it's broad-based. And in the Constitution, which they almost seem in opposition to one another, because the Constitution restricts freedom. It sets forth boundaries and so on. But they understood, they had that in their mind. And even when we talk about liberty in terms of our Baptist heritage, it was always with the assumption that the Holy Spirit would guide people through the Word of God in righteousness. So it was not a free-for-all. A church is not a free-for-all. Society, obviously, shouldn't be a free-for-all. What happens when we have absolute freedom? Anarchy. And what happens with anarchy? We end up in a tyrannical situation, because we're going to be begging someone to take control, right? We don't want the anarchy. So there's always restriction. And then on the other side, the flip side of that is that equality. We all believe in equality. But is there absolute equality? No, there absolutely isn't. The Bible doesn't even suggest that there is. In fact, the Bible assumes that there isn't radical equality in society. Of course, we're not all equal here. We don't all have the same job. We don't all make the same amount of money. We don't all have the same benefits. We don't all have the same intelligence or talent. So there's a lack of equality there. And, of course, what happens if you believe that everyone should be equal, must be equal? What happens then? The government has to step in and force equality, which is exactly what has happened. So when the Bible and Baptists speak of equality, we speak of equality in the sense of we're all equally candidates for salvation. We're all equally sinners. We're all equally unjust in the sight of God, and Christ died for us all equally. The Jews and the Gentiles were saved equally, the same way, right? But the Bible doesn't say that. In fact, the Bible in the law talked about the poor of the land. There was just an assumption that there would be poor in the land. Now, they weren't to be treated poorly. They were to be treated right. In fact, the farmers were told, it was assumed that they would have more, not to do the corners of their fields so that the poor could come in and glean from the corners. Doesn't mean the poor were lazy. That's another thing today. You talk about the poor, and they say you hate the poor. If you talk about people working and we shouldn't have the welfare system that we do, and they say you just hate the poor. I don't hate the poor. I don't hate the poor at all. I don't particularly care for laziness, but they're different. There are people who work very hard who can barely rub two coins together, right? So that's the difference. So when we're talking about, as we talk about Baptist history, we're talking about freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. We're not talking about a licentious type of freedom. We're not talking about an absolute freedom. They clearly understood, the Baptists clearly understood that there was responsibility. They just believed that they should be able to gather together as like-minded people and worship in the structure that they believed was biblical. That was the freedom. And that's what the Bible talks about when it talks about liberty. And we're free from the bondage of sin, right? But the Bible makes it very clear that though I'm free from the world, I'm free from Satan, and I'm free from the bondage of sin, that I have another master, right? And that master, of course, is the Lord himself. So, understand that as we talk about these things. They just believed in this absolute freedom. We all get misty-eyed about the Declaration. I do. The patriotic juices well up, and I get all misty-eyed, and I still it brings a tear to my eye when the Star-Spangled Banner is played. I love it, and I feel like going to the position of attention and looking at the flag, which we had to do when I was in the service. Probably the Air Force, no, right? Or did you? Oh, okay. Just checking. Just making sure. Anyway, but you have to understand they weren't talking about absolute freedom, and that's important to understand as we talk about the revolution in the context of the Baptists. And that's sometimes why, of course, and there were bad apples on both sides, but there were some that actually believed, and we'll see that tonight in this war of the regulation. It was a Baptist, largely Baptists, who were regulators, and some of them were bad actors, and they were as bad. They became as bad because they believed in forcing people to fight with them at the point of a gun, and that's wrong too, right? That's absolutely wrong. So where's the freedom there? So they were fighting for freedom, and that's exactly what they had been fighting for themselves. We've been studying this the last 2 years. Baptists were taking a stand for their own freedom, right? And the people that they were taking a stand against talked about freedom, and they didn't like taxation without representation. And yet they oppressed Baptists and Quakers and whomever else didn't toe the line as far as they were concerned. But when people get saved, and of course that's what happened in the Great Awakening, that's what makes a difference in people's lives. And incidentally, not incidentally, but it's the same today. When people come to know the Lord, that's what's going to make a difference in our society. That's what's going to make a difference around here. That's what's always made a difference. You cannot legislate righteousness. You can't legislate righteousness. And the more lawless a people become because they lack morality or foundation, if the foundations be destroyed, then there are going to be more laws. More control is going to be imposed on people. That's just how it works. It's how it always works. That's how it's always worked in history. So we love freedom. I love freedom. And I want to be able to say what I want, when I want, how I want. Not fire in a theater. We know that there's a restriction there, right? But we understand when we say that, we're saying it with that caveat that there's a responsibility there. And so the freedom that comes with salvation is the freedom to worship God as we choose to worship Him. According to the Word of God, what we believe the Bible says, that's how I want to worship the Lord. And I don't want anyone telling me, nor will I put up with anyone telling me. I mean, I may face persecution for this, and you too, but, for not allowing me, if they suddenly tell me you can't worship the Lord the way you want to. Okay, well, now we have a problem. Okay, so that's where we are to have freedom. That's the type of freedom it's talking about. What's interesting about the Great Awakening and George Whitefield is that he made many Baptists, though, and this I find inexplicable, he never left the Church of England, nor did he ever renounce the erroneous and often persecuting by those who held that position of infant baptism, doctrine of infant baptism. I'm not really sure why he never renounced it, but he made many Baptists. And the Baptists were first called New Lights, then Separates, and finally they were called Baptists. And they spread far and wide, preaching the gospel and standing for truth. And wherever they went, they always ran into a wall, except in Rhode Island. But even now, if they were in Rhode Island today, they wouldn't even know what that looked like, right? Rhode Island is gone. But one of the most prominent men among them that were saved in New England under Whitefield's preaching was Shubal Stearns. And he eventually ended up in North Carolina, and he was called the Apostle to the South. He was a modern day, I say modern in the sense of the United States, but he was a modern day Paul, and he was called the Apostle Paul of the backcountry. And we think of the American Revolution as beginning in New England and Pennsylvania and Virginia, but for those in the South, the war really began in North Carolina with the War of the Regulation, which lasted from 1766 to 1771, also known as the Regulator Revolution. And it was fought over the same principles as the War for Independence was fought over. And it was fought and driven by many Baptists. And as I've tried to find information, and of course it's almost all secular, but some consider, and though this is a controversial view, that the culminating battle, which was the Battle of Alamance in the War of the Regulation, which took place in 1771, is actually the first battle of the Revolutionary War. So there are some who hold that that is the case. Stearns, Shubal Stearns, is important because though he tried to remain neutral in the conflict, the regulators were primarily made up of Baptists who had been saved through his ministry. Though he was against, he didn't want to take up arms. He was opposed to what was happening, but he was against taking up arms. So there were many preachers who did take up arms, and later in the Revolution, there were many preachers who became very active in the Revolutionary War, and many of them as chaplains in the army and so on. So Stearns was born in 1706 in Connecticut. He was a baptized member of the Congregational Church. He wasn't saved until 1745 when he was 39 years old. So you think you're too old. And that was under the preaching of George Whitefield. And Whitefield preached that rather than try to rescue the Congo churches they were members of, they needed to separate as new lights. So that's where that term came from. And then in 1751, so this was 6 years after he was saved, Shubal Stearns rejected infant baptism because when you study it out, you can't come to any other conclusion. And was baptized by the Baptist preacher Waite Palmer and ordained into the ministry by Baptist pastor Joshua Morse. And then Shubal Stearns, a little bit later, and his family and friends became separate Baptists and headed south with his family in 1754. They stopped first in Virginia, and then I guess he had a Macedonian call, right? And but it wasn't to Macedonia, obviously. It was to North Carolina. And he ended up in Sandy Creek in 1755, North Carolina, and he preached there the rest of his life. And he spread the gospel, of course, of repentance and a changed life. They called it experimental Christianity. We might call it experiential Christianity. In other words, a Christianity that was more than just a profession, but it actually resulted the new birth resulted in a new life, right? And he baptized thousands of people in that muddy old creek, Sandy Creek. And if you recall, a couple of years ago, Nate and I went down there, and I remember when we were driving out there, we had gone between two relatively large populated areas in North Carolina. We were heading further south, and the further we went south, the more out in the woods we got. And it was pretty crazy. And the road that we finally ended up on was just a little 2-lane. It was like Union, that was how big it was. And we're driving out on this miles on this road, and we came to this little T. It was an even smaller road, and there was the church right there, the cemetery and the church, and then the old log church up behind it. And we got there, as I've told you, right at sunup, and we were walking around there, and we found Shubal Stearns' gravesite, and we prayed. But what was hard for me to really comprehend was the ministry that he had there, because there's nothing there. There's nothing there now with asphalt. So he's out there in the middle of North Carolina in the woods, but it was on the convergence of a couple of trade routes, and he preached to thousands of people, and that creek is nasty. And we're going to be baptized, and Lord willing, Francine here in a little while, when it warms up a little bit. But, they baptized them in the creek. And when we went down there, was that creek muddy? It was very muddy. And I think it stays muddy pretty much all the time. And he baptized thousands of people there. Thousands of people. And so it was hard for me to just kind of grasp the ministry that he had, and yet that's right where it took place. I mean, you just look at it now and you think, man, there's nothing here. But he was a great man of God. And so men that were saved under his ministry were ordained and fanned out all over the South, into South Carolina, Georgia, even went north into Virginia. They went as far west as the Mississippi. They, the family of Daniel Boone. I told Caleb, I said, if you'd been born, or Nate, if I'd known about Squire Boone, which I never knew about Squire Boone. One of you might have been named Squire. Squire Boone was the brother of Daniel Boone, and he was actually a Baptist preacher. He was a frontiersman. He helped Daniel Boone find and get through the Cumberland Gap, but he was a Baptist preacher, and his parents went to a Baptist church down there that was somehow associated with Shubal Stearns. So very interesting stuff that you just do not hear in secular history at all. And Shubal Stearns is not really credited as part of the Great Awakening, but there were easily as many people saved as a result of his ministry there, and others who were saved under his ministry as there were in the Great Awakening, proper in the North. So it was really incredible. Morgan Edwards, who was a contemporary of Shubal Stearns and a Baptist preacher and historian, wrote, quote, "I believe a preternatural and invisible hand works in the assemblies of the separate Baptists, bearing down the human mind, as was the case in the primitive churches." So when you read about Shubal Stearns and his preaching, it's like he would eye people, look them right in the eye, and it was as if they felt the hand of God, the weight of the Holy Spirit bearing right down on them. I wish I had that, right? And he preached for 16 years there in Sandy Creek until his death in 1771. He was 65 years old. And what's interesting about it is that not one of his messages, and he preached thousands of times there, but not one of his messages was ever written down, which is a pity. That's a shame. It's too bad. It would be awesome to find one of his, something he had actually written, right? So really, by the time of his later ministry and towards his death, Western North Carolina had become quite a Baptist stronghold. And they were very rugged pioneers. They were frontiersmen, as I mentioned. And they had the same character as the men that came before them in New England, John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, those men who had been heavily persecuted. And they were very fearless, and they were very bold for what they believed. And they believed in freedom of conscience and worship, and they were willing to contend for it. And that's the issue. We all believe it, right? I believe in freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, and so on. But I was telling Teresa on the way over here tonight, how far am I willing to contend for it? I mean, how much am I willing to spend for it, or how much cost am I willing to, where's that line, right? And they didn't seem to have a line. They were willing to give everything for it. And at the same time that in Western North Carolina, that Baptist contingent was growing and getting stronger, the Church of England and England wanted to shore up their holdings in North Carolina. So you can see the inevitable clash. And it was inevitable that the two parties would meet, and it would ultimately end in armed conflict. And again, while modern secular history that I found does not particularly say that the War of the Regulators was a war against Baptists, it seems that it was understood as a fact as late as 1930. Historian George Washington Pascal of Wake Forest College wrote, quote, "In case you did not hear me the first time, the War of the Regulators was a war against the Baptists." And it actually started way earlier than that. It started in 1701, and I love the names that were given to these associations, these societies. So in 1701, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in America was founded. Doesn't that sound good? It does. Oh, I like that, but not at the point of a gun. We don't walk around here and coerce people. You either come to church or we'll drag you to church, right? That's not how it works, but that was their idea. And it was a royal charter, and it had the intention of making the Church of England the predominant standing order church in the Americas. In North Carolina, the standing order church, the Episcopal Church, Anglican Church, whatever, was especially weak, and by 1729, there were no Anglican pastors in North Carolina, and by 1760, there were only 5, while the Baptists were really exploding by that time. Remember that Shubal Stearns got there in 1755 and started preaching. So while there was a really strong presence of the Church of England, there was a very strong Baptist presence. And a number of bad things occurred before the War of the Regulation that led to it. Property and poll taxes were levied. You do know that property taxes, what does that mean? And they understood that, huh? Right, you don't own your land. And if you don't believe me, don't pay your taxes for 5 years and see what they do. You won't have your land, they'll take it, right? And of course, there were poll taxes, and there were other taxes that were levied, as we'll talk about in a moment. There was a drought in western North Carolina that put many of the farmers and merchants on the brink of bankruptcy, and wealthy officials were using that to leverage the acquisition of their property, right? So they were in desperate straits, and they were able to acquire the land at greatly reduced prices, which of course they took advantage of. The proclamation of 1763 by the king prohibited the western migration of the pioneers, and this was later referenced by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. And he said of King George III, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. In other words, he wanted all the land for himself. I believe in Maine, which then was Massachusetts, that why was Maine a big shipbuilding state? It's because of the nice white pine trees they had up there. And there are very few of them, if any of them, left, and the king would have his men go through the forest and stamp those trees for the king, and they were going to use those trees for the masts of the ships that they had. And of course, the British Navy was unparalleled at that time. And so the poor little colonists weren't allowed to use those trees. They were the king's forests. And of course, that was what took place in England. In England, you weren't allowed to hunt in certain places, in certain forests, unless you were rich, unless you were a big landowner. So you couldn't hunt. You were restricted as to what you could do in those forests. They were public lands, king's lands, so to speak. So that was a major problem. The king considered it his property, and he didn't want anyone on it, and so he prohibited the western migration of colonists in the United States, which was really why the United States became the United States later on, why we were able to acquire further and further west because of that migration. One of the taxes that was assessed was for the maintenance of the Anglican church and pastor. So can you imagine if we were taxed by the government to pay for the priest over here in the Catholic Church? Would you have a problem with that? Even though you tithe here? I would. I mean, that would bother me. And they had a big problem with it. And it was called a vestry tax. And that was passed in 1755. Of course, that had happened from the very beginning, right from 1620. That was essentially the idea. You were forced to pay a tax to support the pastor of the Congregational Church, the Puritan Church, whatever, even though you didn't believe that they were doing things right. And even though you went to another place and you worshiped there and you had a pastor or whatever. So it's the same thing. So that happened, the vestry tax, about the same time as Shubal Stearns appeared on the scene, and it was a tax. What would we say that about that tax? It was a taxation without representation. And this sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And there were other egregious offenses against the people that were enforced by the governors Dobbs, and then especially a little bit later, William Tryon, who was a really nice guy. The Schism Act of 1714 said that no one could teach unless licensed by the Bishop of London. This is teach church doctrine, right? It was supposedly repealed in 1718, but it was enforced in North Carolina right up until the war. as a means to keep the people and the Baptists illiterate. And they understood this, and it's something that I've always understood, but the powers that be do not want us reading. If there is an illiterate society, we're an enslaved society. Reading is empowering. So that's important. So they understood that then. You just are taught by people that we license to tell you, and you can't think for yourself and don't read anything about anything else. Can't even read the Bible for yourself. The Marriage Act was passed in 1741, and that stated that only the Church of England could perform marriages. In other words, if you were married in any other church other than an Anglican church, your marriage was invalid. So you can imagine as these laws were passed over the years, over the decades, how that would impact the people, and especially Baptists who were worshiping and preaching and marrying, and they were not allowed to do that according to the state. And that would have created a little bit of friction, I would think, as it did. One of the main Baptist strongholds in North Carolina was in Rowan County. And there, the opposition to the North Carolina government was violent. They violently, quote, violently opposed the colonial government's policies. And they were considered, these Baptists there, extremely dangerous by Governor Tryon, the government, and church officials, which were all basically the same, church and state together, right? And it's no different today. That's why tyranny always seeks to crush dissent rather than engage with it. And that's exactly what Governor Tryon set out to do, was to crush dissent. He was going to crush it rather than engage with it at all. The first official opposition was when a crowd of 700 protesters formed near Jersey Baptist Church to stand against the Marriage Act. It was organized and had formulated its demands into written articles. A Moravian settlement diary of the time recorded the event in 1758. Quote, "The mob, about 700 strong, demanded that the vestries," that's that vestry tax, "should be abolished and that each denomination should pay its own ministers," right? The Baptists were derogatorily labeled as Anabaptists, strollers, heretics, and I like this one, enthusiasts. So what does that say about the church situation at the time? They weren't particularly known for their enthusiasm. The Baptists were enthusiastic about their salvation, as they should have been. So they were called enthusiasts. One Anglican pastor, the Reverend, I was going to add, the Most Reverend Mr. Reed, wrote that the separate Baptists were, quote, "preaching up the inexpediency of human learning and the practice of moral virtue." And the, quote, enthusiasts were obstinately illiterate and grossly ignorant, which is what the ruling class, that's how they always think. That's what they always push. The fact is that they weren't illiterate or ignorant. Like the majority of the apostles, think about it. Some of them were educated. Paul obviously was well educated. What was Peter, James, John, and Andrew? They were fishermen. I don't think they had a higher college degree, a master's degree. They pulled nets on a fishing boat, and yet they could write and read, right, and preach. So that wasn't the issue. Being called illiterate and ignorant was merely the standing order's way of discrediting and disregarding them. And I've read even today where so-called scientists will not debate non-scientist preachers on the theory of evolution. And they give the exact same reason, because they're not learned, it would be a waste of time, right? I mean, they're so far beneath me that it's pointless, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is that they know they would be faced with defending their views with real facts, which they can't do. So, they degrade and so on. There were actually some Anglican pastors who didn't hate the Baptists. Rather, they wrote that the Baptists actually were of help to them. Reverend Michael Smith said, quote, "I find these preachers have been of great service to me." And Baptists should be. We should be a help to people and be kind to people and be a help generally as Christians and as a Baptist church, but in society in general, right? We help people. We don't hurt people. And that's what the honest ones wrote that about them. He says, "I find these preachers have been of great service to me." And the Anglican Reverend Bartlett wrote that the Baptists of Lockswood Folly had allowed him to use their meeting house for Episcopalian services. The Moravians also felt a kinship to the Baptists and even enlisted their services to preach at their meetings. Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall, who is another great Baptist preacher, both often preached in the Moravian town of Wachovia. The Moravian pastor Soule wrote of them, quote, "Mr. Harris, a well-known Baptist of Virginia," he'd been a colonel, and he was severely persecuted in Virginia, "visited here to acquaint himself with our doctrine and Constitution and to talk with us. We hope that this may be for his good and the good of those to whom he preaches, for at this time the Baptists are the only ones in the country who go far and wide preaching and caring for souls." So even then they had that's what they were known for. They were known for the Great Commission, going out and reaching the lost. And of course, like today, that's our mandate today. We're to reach out to lost souls. We're to be a witness. Now, we're not responsible for people actually getting saved, but we're responsible for getting the gospel to people as best as we can. So the eastern part of the state was largely controlled by the Crown and the Anglican Episcopalian Church. And once again, the matter of infant baptism became the impetus in the fight. Reed wrote, quote, "I do affirm that they, the Baptists, sprung from the seed which he, Whitefield, first planted in New England, and the difference of soil may perhaps have caused such an alteration in the fruit that he being Whitefield, may be ashamed of it." And what I find sad about this is that when Whitefield heard about the criticism of his ministry, he affirmed his belief in infant sprinkling and that he was a minister of the Church of England, which that kind of bothers me, to be honest with you. Because he was a great man of God. I mean, he really preached, but there he could not make that break. And infant baptism pedobaptism is not just undoctrinal. I mean, it makes people, it's of the devil. I mean, it's a devilish doctrine. So I don't understand that, how someone who could preach such a powerful salvation message and preach repentance and salvation and a changed life could be so biblically off on the clear doctrine of baptism. But anyway, this only added fuel when Whitefield reaffirmed his stand, his position on infant baptism and in the Church of England. It just added fuel and legitimacy to the opposition to Baptists. Okay, they felt that they were right. If he had perhaps taken a stand, he could have had quite an influence and said, you know, this is, what you're doing is wrong. They're right. And they're taking the right stand, but he didn't do that. So when Governor Tryon took over as governor in 1765, one of his main objects was to make western North Carolina an Anglican stronghold as well. Thus, he began to enforce in earnest the vestry tax with brute force and installing pastors from the Church of England. He was not only the governor, but he became Bishop of North Carolina with sole authority over what they preached and how they worshiped. But through it all, as is usually the case, the Baptists, Christians, I know there are other Christians beside Baptists, but this is Baptist history. The Baptists continued to grow and thrive and were quickly becoming an even larger thorn in the governor's plans for the Anglican Church in North Carolina. Another tactic that he used was to pit. He was a consummate politician, and they're good at reading the air, right? And they know how to do things, right? Was to pit the Presbyterians against the Baptists. Now, he didn't have any use for the Presbyterians, but he would pit the Presbyterians against the Baptists. Apparently, there was already bad blood between the Baptists and Presbyterians, as the Baptists had largely supplanted whatever Presbyterians there were in Pennsylvania, and were in the process of doing so in North Carolina. And Tryon was, though he was corrupt, he was not stupid. And he sensed quite an opportunity there. And he gave the Presbyterians the right to perform wedding ceremonies where the Baptists were prohibited from it, which further made the Baptists mad because they were not allowed. Reed, the same Anglican preacher, wrote that the kindness of the Presbyterians was nothing more than political expediency. He fully recognized that. And he said, quote, an explanation of why the bill in favor of the Presbyterians had been allowed to pass upon the fate of these other bills were dependent, and it was good policy to keep the dissenters, the Presbyterians, in as good a humor as possible at such a critical juncture. So Tryon began to build an army, and he actively recruited Presbyterian pastors to enlist their constituents. So that would be like the governor coming to the Baptist preachers in what's her name, Kelly Ayotte? And coming, sometimes I have a hard time remembering that, coming and saying, we want you to get all your male members to be soldiers to fight against this other religious group over here, the Methodists, right? So we'd have to go to war with the diaper church down here, whatever they call that church down here. I know that's probably a little crude, but that's what I've heard it's called. Nate says when he's witnessed to people, they like, you go to that the diaper church over there. Nate's no. We're just before that on the right. But anyway, but that's exactly the same type of situation where we'd have to, at the behest of the governor, go fight with other denominations as pawns in his scheme to maintain control. Does all this sound like it's ever happened since then? I think it has. It happens all the time. Politicians are excellent at using people as pawns for their own political gain. So he enlisted the Presbyterian pastors to enlist their constituents in his army. Tryon used propaganda by telling the people that he needed their help to, quote, prevent the infection spreading among the people. The infection being the Baptists, and the Quakers, and some others. The army was made up of men from primarily Presbyterian counties. He marched on Wachovia to get the Moravians to turn on the Baptists and Quakers. And he again lied by saying that his problem was with a small faction of the Baptists and Quakers. The lie is in the fact that it was a large faction of Baptists, almost all of the Baptists, and the Quakers don't bear arms. They didn't bear arms, right? They were peace-loving people as much as they could be. So at this point in 1768, the faction organized into the Regulators, who Governor Tryon repeatedly referred to as being Baptists. So in his mind, there was no difference between the Regulators and the Baptists, where today they don't even mention Baptists in talking about the War of the Regulation, because it was primarily Baptists who were Regulators. And as I mentioned, most modern sources I've read don't even mention the Baptists as being part of this. They would have us believe that it was purely a secular resistance and had nothing to do with religious freedom whatsoever. But James Beller, points out that not one Baptist community sent a soldier to help Tryon. In 1768, Tryon sent a letter to the Regulators promising them redress of grievances, while at the same time declaring, quote, the Baptists were the avowed enemy of Mother Church and enemies to society and a scandal to common sense. So while at the same time promising to listen to them and hear them, he was telling everybody that they were the scum of the earth and needed to be eradicated, essentially. And Baptists have always faced this sort of persecution. And of course, the real issue isn't baptism. That's just the catalyst, or the trying to think of the word. The pretext is the word I'm looking for. The real issue is power. The real issue is control. It's always power and control. And the idea of infant baptism as opposed to baptism by immersion of a saved person is someone who understands, is a matter of control. They wouldn't have control over those people anymore. They wouldn't have control over their minds. And of course, greed was part of it. Baptism was just the vehicle through which the tyrants sought their control. It's a tool. So the next few years saw an escalation of intimidation tactics. Backed by his army, Tryon regularly infringed on the individual rights of citizens. In the spring of 1768, the horse of a regulator was seized for back taxes in Rowan County. And you say, that's not a big deal. Hannah came up to me tonight and she said, Dad, at supper, she said, Dad, we found a horse for $150. And I was like, the hay to feed the horse, one hay bale, one of those big round ones, would cost more than $150. And I was like, it ain't happening. It's not happening, right? But back then, a horse today is just a hobby. And if you have a horse or want a horse, more power to you. If you can afford a horse, I don't have any problem with it. Doesn't matter to me at all. But back then, horse was life. It was like a car, okay? And you didn't have stores on every street corner. You had to travel a good distance. And so his horse was seized for back taxes in Rowan County. The regulators mounted up, went to the county courthouse in Hillsborough, overpowered the sheriffs and officers, and took the horse back. So that's kind of how it went. Tryon marched on Hillsborough and arrested what he considered two of the ringleaders, Herman Husbands and William Butler. Some Baptists began to head west in search of a freer place and ended up in what is now Tennessee. Tryon also wanted to, what else do you think he wanted to do with the regulators? It has to do with the Second Amendment. He wanted to disarm the regulators. The Puritans had done it to the opinionists in 1635. In other words, they disarmed the opinionists, the Baptists, right? They were opinionists. They had their own opinion. And that's always been a tactic used when a government wants to subjugate its people. It's not about our good. If they take away our ability to defend ourselves, you can count on tyranny. That's just the way it is. In the North Carolina wilderness, it was a practical impossibility to disarm the people. Sending his troops to disarm all the pioneers and frontiersmen would have been tantamount to an open declaration of war, and their style of fighting was not conducive to British conventional warfare. At the same time as all of this, the sheriffs were defrauding the people by collecting taxes to pay provincial debt, yet the debt that they collected the taxes for was left unpaid and lined their pockets. Is that any different than having a daycare? And by the way, daycare is a lucrative business. It really is. You open a daycare, for every kid you get so much money from the state and so much money from the government, besides whatever the people pay. And that fraud that's been going on all over the place, people have opened up daycares and they've said, I've got 20 kids, and they don't have any, but they get like $6,000 a month for each kid, right? So they live well. But that's fraud. But that's exactly what these people were doing. They were it's the same type of thing. They were collecting taxes to pay debt, and yet they weren't paying the debt. They were keeping the money. An investigation in 1768 showed that 64,000 pounds had been collected and no debt paid. The regulators demanded an accounting, and none was given. Instead of disarmament, and because of the organization of the regulators, Tryon passed a law against peaceful assembly. Pascoe wrote of this law, quote, Tryon by numerous proclamations sought to rob the oppressed of the right of assembling so as to formulate their grievances. It's hard to believe this is the United States of America that this stuff was happening in. While Samuel Johnston and others who followed his lead as a fitting summation of the invasion of the rights of the people passed that, I'm still quoting, passed that bloody act, making it a felony for the wronged farmers of Orange to hold or to have held such assemblies. They couldn't even assemble publicly for a redress of grievances. And yet, the bust of the same Samuel Johnston is set in a niche of the North Carolina state capital, and he's one of the ones that passed that law, even today. So Samuel Johnson was a wealthy planter and head of the Masons in North Carolina, who was on the side of Tryon. Judge Edmund Fanning wrote, quote, that their union with the Masons was so strong and widespread in the county that the common people were powerless to elect other officers. So they held complete control. In the Assembly of 1769, there was a petition from 3 of the primarily Baptist counties to change the vestry tax, marriage law, and tax collection in general to combat fraud. They were ignored. So you can see where this is heading, right? So they're trying every way peacefully to deal with this. That year, the Sandy Creek Baptist Association took up the matter of the regulators. Shubal Stearns was its head, and everyone was interested in what he had to say. This was just two years before he died. There were men among the regulators who were coercing other men, Baptists, to join their ranks. And while that's wrong, the cause that they were taking up was a just cause. The way they were going about making people fight with them was wrong. It wasn't any different than what Tryon was doing. And Shubal Stearns tried to remain neutral by advocating not drawing the sword against the government, while also advocating not joining the provincial militia. So he said, don't fight against the governor, and don't fight with the governor, right? And don't join the regulators. Just don't do anything. As they would have been marching on friends and families. And I was thinking about this as I studied this. It's the question that every Baptist preacher, every Baptist, every person has to ask himself. Right? It's something that I've wrestled with myself many times. What would I do in a situation like that? And it's easy to, I know what I do. I don't know what I do. I've never had to face that situation. I've never been put in a situation where it might cost me everything to take a stand, and where I had to take a stand because we don't face that kind of persecution. Although, I think we pay taxes that are very unjust and that go to things that we would consider an abomination to God. But, that's I was going to say, what are you going to do, right? Well, they knew what they were going to do. And James Beller, that book that I have on Baptist history, believes that Shubal Stearns, was acting in accordance with his view on Romans 12:18. So I believe that he was acting in accordance with his conscience. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him, but we've preached on it here. Nate's preached on it. I think Elijah's preached on it. I've certainly preached on it. But anyway, the limited general history of the time showed that Baptists in Europe had taken a position of pacifism in neither fighting against nor for the government. The Moravians, on the other hand, were willing to defend their homes with force. Stearns' mind was to introduce a resolution into the Sandy Creek Association, this is the Baptist Association, banning armed rebellion against the government. The Sandy Creek Association was at its pinnacle at this time of influence and was the largest socio-religio-political force in western North Carolina. And as I mentioned, it was Baptist. The meetings would start with prayer and preaching and end with prayer and preaching. On the third day of the 1769 meeting, Shubal Stearns took up the cause of the regulators. He wasn't opposed to their cause, and that's important, but their methods. He wouldn't take up arms against the government. The resolution that he put forward, that he backed, stated, quote, the resolve of the Baptist Association held at Sandy Creek the second Saturday in October 1769. I still have a hard time believing this was at Sandy Creek. I mean, you'd have to see it. If any of our members shall take up arms against the legal authority or aid or abet them that do so, he shall be excommunicated. And it was at that point that armed regulators entered the assembly and attempted to thwart the resolution. Morgan Edwards, who was the only recorded Baptist loyalist during this time and during the Revolutionary War proper, wrote that Stearns was afraid of the regulators. But I happen to agree with Beller that it's doubtful he was scared. I mean, this guy had preached to thousands of hostile pioneers. And if you read some of the stories of some of the guys that went there to actually mock him and degrade him and take him on. He'd give them the eye and preach right to them, and some of them would, then they'd back off. And one of the, I can't remember his name now, he was an old woodsman, great big hulking guy, could have squashed Shubal Stearns with, very little effort. And Shubal Stearns just followed him around while he was preaching, and he kept getting farther and farther away, and it just seemed like his eye was following him whenever. And finally, he just had to repent. He got saved and became a great preacher. So I happen to agree with Beller that I don't think that he was necessarily afraid. I lost my place. But in any event, the resolution was tabled. And even Morgan Edwards, who we just mentioned, did not record Stearns' answer to these men. It was put off. So there wasn't enough support for what Stearns was proposing. In other words, most people were in favor of armed resistance. So in both North Carolina and Virginia, in spite of all of these problems, people were still getting saved, and the Baptists were rapidly growing. And of course, the Baptists just have always naturally gravitated to freedom of speech and worship. And as I've told you before, which is not taught in the public schools, that James Madison, who was the author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, was heavily influenced by Baptists of his day, men like John Leland, who really pushed for the way it was written, the separation of powers and an individual Bill of Rights. So as these people got saved and gravitated towards freedom of speech and worship, the tensions continued to mount. They continued to rise. And honestly, Governor Tryon could have done a lot to alleviate the problem by simply, honestly, listening to the grievances and investigating them. Even if he hadn't really done anything about it, if he said, look, I'm going to listen to you, and I'm going to look into it, all right? Let me look into it. That would have alleviated a lot of the problem, even if it was nothing more than political expedience, which, how often does that placate us? All the time, right? But his method was heavy-handedness, and it was very much like the Pharaoh of Exodus, right? Instead of lessening the pressure, he increased the pressure. And Beller points out that in 1770 at the Sandy Creek meeting, a year after the one we were just talking about, there was confusion. The Baptists wanted to obey the Lord, and at the same time they were suffering under a heavy-handed government which seemed to understand nothing but brute force. So what do you do in a situation like that? And again, it's a situation that we really haven't experienced. We've not experienced this. So you're trying to do what you believe is right, worship, witness, according to the Bible, and yet at the same time you've got a government that won't allow you to do so. That's just putting a heavy hand on you and taking essentially everything you have and telling you can't do this, you can't worship, you can't assemble, you can't complain to us about the problem that we're imposing on you, right? So there was confusion at that meeting, and at that meeting there didn't seem to be any clear answer, which to me that seems more like the way it is in my own mind, right? The government was filled with corruption, and Tryon did nothing. The regulators went to Hillsborough again in 1770, and this brought the western counties to the brink of war with Tryon. At this point, George Whitefield had died. He had just died, and Shubal Stearns would die within a few months. And this was the last meeting at Sandy Creek before he died, and it had become so large, so filled with representatives from Baptists and Baptist churches all over North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. It was broken up into 3 separate associations, and because of that, Shubal Stearns, who had a very powerful voice, remember, he was not for pacifism necessarily, but he was for more passive resistance, though resisting, okay? But he lost his influence because the association was broken up into 3 separate associations. And the separate Baptists at that point lost their unanimity. There was no more cohesion. 1,500 Baptist families left for Western Virginia, which became West Virginia at the later, Kentucky and Tennessee, and it was of the Lord. They took revival with them, so it was providential. As they moved west, they took the gospel. In 1765, there were only 5 Anglican priests in North Carolina, but by the end of 1770s, Governor Tryon, had installed 18 priests in 32 parishes. So quite an increase. The march on Hillsborough by the regulators was with a letter to the county court. Quote, "We have labored honestly for our bread and studied to defraud no man, nor live on the spoils of other men's labors, nor snatch the bread out of other men's hands. Out of other men's hands. Our only crime with which they can charge us is virtue in the highest degree, namely, to risk our all to save our country from rapine and slavery in our detecting of practices which the law allows to be worse than robbery. To sum up the whole matter of our petition in a few words, it is namely that we may obtain unprejudiced juries, that all extortionate officers, lawyers, and clerks may be brought to fair trials." That was what they wanted. And unsurprisingly, that didn't happen. But instead, Tryon was determined to destroy this rebellion by force. He marched to western North Carolina with his army, determined to, as Beller put it, kill, humiliate, and scatter the Baptists. He sent a letter mandating that it be read to the regulators to submit or be called traitors and treated as such. The regulators refused and gathered a force of 2,000 against 1,000 militia under Tryon, and he also had 8 cannon on May 16th, 1771. And Tryon won the day. He killed 100 regulators, and he wounded 200. The Baptists, the regulators, were no match for trained militia and proper military leadership. And most of those killed were Baptists. And we passed the battle site of Alamance. We didn't have time to stop. We wanted to. But we drove on the way to Sandy Creek. It's 18 miles north of Sandy Creek. We passed right by it. You can go there, and they have a fort set up there and everything. Tryon had camped at Sandy Creek on the farm of Baptist regulator leader Benjamin Morrill. He was captured, convicted of treason, and publicly hung. His body was quartered and scattered. So this was Governor Tryon. The Boston Gazette said of Benjamin Morrill on August 12, 1771 that, quote, "Morrill died in the most heroic manner, his children being around him at the place of his execution. He declared that he died in peace with his Maker and in the cause of his oppressed countrymen." And there were 7 other Baptists that were executed along with him. In the aftermath, Tryon forced 6,400 North Carolinians to swear allegiance to the provincial government. But it is estimated that there were over 50,000 people who had been active in the regulators. It's interesting, they only put together a force of about 2,000. 2 of the primary leaders of the regulator movement, and you may recognize at least one of these men, were John Gano and Joseph Murphy, one of Shubelstern's primary preachers. Anybody know who John Gano was? He baptized George Washington in the Potomac River, which is very interesting. He was a very prolific preacher and active participant in the American Revolutionary War. Tryon put a bounty on Murphy's head, but he hid in a cave on Squire and Sarah Boone's property. That was the parents of Daniel and Squire Jr., who were members of Murphy's church. He was never caught. Tryon seemed to have triumphed at the last by winning the Battle of Alamance. He was soon called to be governor of New York in June 1771, and it was there a few years later he met George Washington and the Continental Army. Thus, in essence, Alamance was the first battle of the Revolution and a rallying cry for the later patriots who would fight on other fields. The Baptists of North Carolina had been decimated. Their churches dwindled, families left. The Sandy Creek Baptist Church was reduced. Listen to this. I have a hard time, 900 members. in Sandy Creek. If you ever get a chance, I'd love to just take the church down there like on a 3-day expedition and just go down there and not do it the way Nate and I did it. We drove all night, and we were there for an hour, and we left and drove all the way home. We drove nonstop, and that was too much. But just go there and see it. And I'm not going to say there's no awe or anything like that. I mean, it's not holy ground. But it certainly was neat to get there at sunup and pray over Shubal Stern's grave. But to look, 900 members to 13 members. The people that left went, like the members of the Jerusalem church under the persecution of Saul, bearing precious seed, so they spread out. So you have to believe it was providential. We look at it, we say, man, that was awful. It was, but it was also providential because the gospel spread far and wide. The year of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the North Carolina Congress met and abolished the Vestry and Marriage Acts. What's interesting today is that Shubal Stearns, who was, while he was against the War of the Regulation in the sense of taking up arms for their cause, though, it was largely his preaching and the men and women who were saved under his preaching who were the ones that took that stand for freedom. But he's largely forgotten. Until Bobby Mitchell mentioned Shubal Stearns to me 5 years ago, I'd never heard his name. Never heard of him. He's largely forgotten. And Beller points out that he that demonstrated the most mercy in the Bible barely received any in return. And that's kind of how it is with Shubal Stearns. Paul himself wrote of almost everyone turning away from him in his hour of greatest need. Of course, that was the case with the Lord as well. So that's it for tonight. Hope it was interesting. And that's pretty much it. I mean, we haven't had as many classes this year. Any questions?